My cousin brought my son a tarantula knowing he's terrified of spiders. I gave her daughter something worse. My son Ryan was 8 years old and had been afraid of spiders since he was 3 when one crawled on his face during a camping trip. Not just scared, but full-on phobia where he'd freeze and shake and sometimes throw up if he even saw a picture of one. We'd been working with a therapist for 2 years and kept our house completely spider-free. Everyone in the family knew about Ryan's fear because we'd had to leave 3 family gatherings when someone mentioned seeing a spider or showed him something with spider decorations. My cousin Melanie thought this was ridiculous and said we were babying him. She had a daughter named Grace who was 9, and according to Melanie was fearless because she didn't coddle her. At every family event, Melanie would make comments about Ryan needing to toughen up. She'd say things like kids today are too soft and when she was young nobody had phobias because their parents didn't allow it. My mom would tell her to stop, but Melanie would roll her eyes and say she was just being honest. Ryan's birthday was coming up and I made it clear to everyone that it was superhero themed. No bugs, no nature stuff, definitely no spiders. I sent a text to the family group chat reminding them about Ryan's phobia and asking them to check any gifts to make sure they didn't have spider imagery. Everyone said they understood. Melanie replied with a thumbs up emoji. The day of the party, Melanie showed up late carrying a large box with air holes. She said she had the perfect gift that would change Ryan's life. I felt my stomach drop but tried to stay calm. Maybe it was a hamster or something normal. Ryan opened his other presents first and was having a great time. Then Melanie insisted he open hers. She handed him the box and told him to be careful because it was special. Ryan opened the box and screamed. Inside was a live tarantula in a small tank. A Chilean rose-hair tarantula, to be exact. Ryan fell backwards off his chair and started hyperventilating. He was shaking so hard he couldn't stand up. I grabbed the box and shoved it at Melanie while my husband carried Ryan inside. He threw up twice and couldn't stop crying for an hour. The other kids at the party were upset, and some parents took their kids home early. Melanie stood there saying this was exposure therapy and we were overreacting. She said the spider was harmless and Ryan needed to face his fears. She said the pet store told her it was perfect for children and she'd spent $200 on the whole setup. My mother told Melanie to leave immediately. Melanie said we were raising a weak child and someday we'd thank her for trying to help. She took the spider and left, but not before telling everyone there that we'd ruined Ryan's chance to grow up normal. Ryan had nightmares for weeks. He wouldn't go in the living room where it happened. He started checking his bed and closet obsessively. His therapist said this set back months of progress. I was beyond furious. That's when I learned something interesting about Grace from my aunt. Grace was terrified of dolls. Not just uncomfortable, but completely terrified of porcelain dolls, ventriloquist dummies, anything with a human face that wasn't alive. Melanie had mentioned it once at a family dinner years ago, saying Grace would cry if she saw one in a store. Apparently, Grace watched a horror movie at a sleepover when she was 6 and never recovered. Melanie kept their house doll-free and avoided that aisle in stores. Perfect. I waited a month until Melanie's husband invited us to Grace's dance recital. The whole family would be there. I bought something special for Grace. Not just any doll, but a vintage ventriloquist dummy from an estate sale. This thing was nightmare fuel with cracked paint, glass eyes that seemed to follow you, and a mouth that didn't quite close properly. I also bought a beautiful gift bag and tissue paper. At the recital, I gave Grace her gift after she performed. I said it was a special congratulations present. Melanie wasn't paying attention because she was talking to another parent about how talented Grace was. Grace opened the bag and pulled out the dummy. She screamed so loud the entire auditorium turned to look. She dropped it and backed away, crying hysterically. The dummy's head turned sideways when it hit the ground, making it look even worse. Grace ran to the bathroom and wouldn't come out. Melanie grabbed the dummy and shoved it back in the bag, her face bright red. She hissed at me that I knew about Grace's fear. I said I had no idea, and the antique store said it was a valuable collectible perfect for children. I said maybe this was good exposure therapy. I said Grace needed to face her fears instead of being coddled. I repeated every single thing Melanie had said at Ryan's party but about Grace. The other parents were staring and whispering. Someone asked why Melanie was so upset about a toy. Another parent said their kid loved puppets and maybe Grace needed to toughen up. Melanie tried to explain, but it sounded exactly like what she'd mocked us for. She ended up leaving the recital early with Grace still crying. The next week, Melanie called to rage at me. She was screaming before I even said hello. Her voice came through the phone, so loud I had to hold it away from my ear. She called me a vindictive monster who deliberately hurt her daughter. She said I knew exactly what I was doing, and there was no excuse for giving that horrible dummy to a child when I knew about her fear. She kept saying I traumatized Grace on purpose, and what kind of person does that to a 9-year-old? Her words came out fast and angry, barely stopping for breath. I could hear her crying between the yelling, these wet, gasping sounds that should have made me feel bad, but mostly just made me feel satisfied. I let her go on for maybe 2 minutes before I interrupted in this calm voice that didn't sound like mine. I told her the antique store said it was a valuable collectible perfect for children. I said maybe Grace just needs some exposure therapy to toughen up instead of being coddled her whole life. I used her exact words from Ryan's party, the same cold tone she'd used while my son was throwing up in the bathroom. The silence on the other end lasted about 5 seconds. Then Melanie started crying harder and saying this was completely different because Grace's fear came from real trauma. She said Grace saw actual horror movie images that scarred her, not like Ryan, who was just being babied about regular spiders that can't even hurt him. She went on about how we made Ryan's fear worse by protecting him from everything, instead of teaching him to be brave. I felt this twisted satisfaction hearing her make excuses that sounded exactly like what she'd dismissed about my son. Every word out of her mouth was the same logic I'd tried to use at Ryan's party, while she rolled her eyes and called us overprotective. The living room door opened and my husband walked in carrying his coffee mug. He saw my face and stopped moving, his eyes going from me to the phone and back again. He didn't ask who it was or try to take the phone away. He just set his mug down on the side table and sat next to me on the couch, putting his hand on my shoulder. His touch was warm and steady, not trying to stop me but letting me know he was there. Melanie's voice got louder again, demanding I apologize to Grace right now. She said if I didn't admit what I did was wrong, she'd turn the whole family against me. She'd tell everyone what kind of person I really was, someone who hurts innocent children to get revenge. She said Grace was having nightmares and couldn't sleep alone and it was all my fault. I waited until she finished, and then told her in that same cold voice that I'd apologize when she apologized to Ryan for the tarantula. We both knew that was never happening. The silence stretched out again, and I could hear her breathing, these short, angry huffs. Then she started yelling again, but I pressed the end call button in the middle of her sentence. The phone went quiet in my hand, and I just sat there shaking. My whole body felt like it was vibrating from the inside, this weird combination of triumph and nausea. My husband squeezed my shoulder and asked if I was okay. I opened my mouth to say yes, but realized I didn't actually know the answer to that question. The shaking got worse, and I had to set the phone down because my hands wouldn't stay steady. I heard footsteps on the stairs and then Ryan's voice asking what all the yelling was about. He stood in the doorway in his pajamas, his hair sticking up on one side from sleeping. His eyes were wide and worried, looking between me and his dad. I had to decide right then whether to tell him the truth about what I did to Grace. For a second, I almost said it. Almost explained that I'd given his cousin something scary on purpose to teach Melanie a lesson. But then I looked at his face and couldn't make myself say the words. I told him it was just adult stuff and he should go back to bed. He stood there for another moment like he wanted to ask more questions. But my husband got up and walked him back upstairs. I heard their voices getting quieter as they went down the hall. I sat alone on the couch protecting my son from knowing his mother became someone cruel. That night I couldn't sleep at all. I kept replaying Grace's scream in my head, that high-pitched sound that filled the whole auditorium. I remembered exactly how her face looked when she saw the dummy, the way her eyes went huge and her mouth opened in terror. The memory played over and over like a video I couldn't turn off. It sounded exactly like Ryan's scream when he saw the tarantula, the same pitch and desperation. That thought made my chest feel tight like someone was sitting on it. I rolled over and stared at the ceiling, counting the shadows from the streetlight outside. My husband was asleep next to me, breathing slow and even. I wanted to wake him up and ask if I was a bad person, but I was too scared of what he might say. The clock said 3 a.m, and I was still wide awake, seeing Grace's face every time I closed my eyes. The next morning, my mother called before I even finished my first cup of coffee. She said Melanie had been texting the entire family about what I did. She'd sent long messages to everyone explaining how I deliberately traumatized Grace with that dummy because I'm a terrible person who can't handle conflict like an adult. My mother's voice sounded tired and disappointed. She said half the relatives were saying I went too far, and the other half were saying Melanie had it coming after what she did to Ryan. The family was splitting into sides and everyone was fighting in the group chat. My uncle posted something about both of us being wrong and 3 people jumped on him immediately. My mother asked me what I was thinking and I didn't have a good answer. The doorbell rang around 10 and I found my sister standing there holding 2 coffees from the shop downtown. She walked past me into the kitchen without waiting for an invitation and set the cups on the counter. She looked at me directly with this serious expression and asked if I felt good about what I did. Her voice wasn't angry, just curious and maybe a little sad. I told her I felt like I finally stood up for my son after months of Melanie making him feel weak and broken. But my voice didn't sound as confident as I wanted it to, coming out quieter and less sure with every word. Cecilia looked at me over her coffee cup and waited for me to say something real. She told me she got why I did it, but Grace was going to have nightmares now just like Ryan does. The question hung there between us about whether hurting another kid was really the answer. I felt my face get hot and told her she didn't understand what it was like watching your kid suffer. She set down her cup and said she understood perfectly fine, but that didn't make what I did okay. I stood up and started loading the dishwasher even though it was already full because I needed something to do with my hands. She asked if making Grace scared helped Ryan feel any better, and I didn't have an answer for that. The coffee got cold while we sat there not really talking anymore, and finally she said she had to go pick up her kids. After she left, I checked my phone and saw 3 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. The next day, Ryan's therapist called while I was folding laundry. She needed to reschedule his appointment and mentioned she heard there was another incident at a family event. Her voice was careful, like she was trying not to judge, but I could hear the question underneath. I told her we could do Thursday instead, and she said that worked fine. After I hung up, I realized word was spreading through the family fast, and soon everyone would know exactly what kind of person I'd become. My hands shook while I folded Ryan's shirts, and I had to redo 3 of them because I kept messing up the sleeves. The phone rang again an hour later. My aunt's voice sounded tired when I answered. She said she needed to tell me something about Grace. Grace had been sleeping in Melanie's bed every night since the recital and wouldn't go near her own room. She kept saying the dummy's eyes were watching her even after Melanie got rid of it. My stomach dropped hearing how similar it sounded to Ryan's trauma. My aunt asked if I knew why Grace got so upset at the recital, and I lied and said I had no idea. She sighed and said the whole family was worried about both kids now. After we hung up, I sat on the couch staring at nothing for 20 minutes. I tried to make myself feel better by remembering Ryan's birthday party. Melanie stood there while he threw up and shook, and she showed no remorse at all. She called him weak and said we were ruining his chance to be normal. But the memory didn't help like I thought it would. The reason felt thinner now that I knew Grace was suffering the same way Ryan did. I got up and made myself lunch but couldn't eat any of it. The sandwich sat on the plate getting soggy while I scrolled through my phone trying to distract myself from thinking about Grace's face when she saw that dummy. Melanie posted something on social media that afternoon. It was vague but obviously about me, talking about family betrayal and people showing their true colors. I watched the comments pile up with relatives saying they supported her and asking if she was okay. She was building a story where she was the victim and I was the bad guy. My cousin left 3 heart emojis. My uncle commented asking what happened. Melanie replied saying some people can't handle honest feedback about their parenting. I wanted to comment back, but knew it would just make everything worse. Instead, I put my phone face down on the counter and went to start dinner early, even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. My phone buzzed with a text from Frank while I was chopping vegetables. He said he thought what I did was perfect, and Melanie needed to learn what it feels like. He added 3 laughing emojis and said karma was real. His support should have made me feel better, but instead it made me feel worse. I'd dragged other people into something ugly, and now Frank was taking sides. I texted back a thumbs up because I didn't know what else to say. The knife slipped and I almost cut my finger. I put it down and leaned against the counter trying to breathe normally. Ryan came into the kitchen after school and dropped his backpack by the door. He asked why we hadn't seen Grace and Melanie lately. I realized he didn't understand that his birthday party disaster had broken apart the entire family. He thought they were just busy like normal people get busy. I told him they had a lot going on right now and we'd see them soon. The lie tasted bad in my mouth. He shrugged and asked what was for dinner. I was protecting him from knowing he was at the center of all this fighting between adults who should know better. 2 weeks went by with no contact from Melanie. The family group chat stayed quiet except for my mother posting pictures of her garden. Then Melanie's husband called my husband one evening while we were watching TV. I could hear my husband's side of the conversation from the couch. He was suggesting the 4 of us meet to talk things through. My husband looked at me and asked if I was willing to sit down with them. I said yes, even though the idea of sitting across from Melanie made my chest tight. We set it up for Saturday at a restaurant halfway between our houses. I spent the next 3 days feeling sick about it. Saturday came and we got to the restaurant first. Melanie and her husband showed up 10 minutes late. The tension was so thick nobody could eat their food. We all ordered and then sat there moving things around our plates. Melanie's husband tried to play mediator and suggested we both say we hurt each other's kids and move forward. But Melanie interrupted before I could answer. She said what I did was on purpose while she was trying to help Ryan. Her voice got louder and people at other tables started looking over. I snapped and told Melanie that bringing a live spider to a birthday party when everyone knew about his fear wasn't help. I said it was mean and cruel and she knew it would hurt him. She leaned back in her chair and said she really thought it would cure him. She said the pet store told her exposure therapy works and she spent good money on that setup. I almost believed she was that confused about her own actions. Her husband put his hand on her arm and asked her to lower her voice. The waiter came by to refill our water glasses, and we all sat there silent until he left. Melanie leaned forward and her voice dropped to something sharp and mean. She said I needed to admit what I did, to say out loud that I picked that dummy on purpose because I knew it would scare Grace. I sat there with my hands in my lap, not looking at her, not saying anything. The silence stretched out and I could feel everyone at nearby tables pretending not to listen. My husband shifted in his seat next to me. Melanie kept staring at me, waiting for me to confess, and the truth sat between us like something heavy and ugly. If I said yes, I'd have to accept that I hurt a 9-year-old kid on purpose, that I became the kind of person who uses a child's fear as a weapon. But we both already knew what I'd done. Not saying it out loud didn't make it less true. Melanie's face got red and she said she knew I did it, and my silence proved everything. Her husband put his hand on her arm, but she pulled away from him. My husband finally spoke up and tried to change the subject. He said maybe we should talk about how to help both kids going forward, how to make sure they felt safe at family events. He suggested we could coordinate who came to what gatherings, so the kids didn't have to see each other until they were ready. Melanie cut him off before he could finish. She said there wouldn't be any coordinating because she wasn't bringing Grace anywhere near us anymore. She said I'd proven I was dangerous and she wouldn't risk her daughter's safety around me. That word hit me hard and sat in my chest like a rock. Dangerous. I'd never thought of myself that way before, but maybe it was accurate. I'd deliberately scared a child badly enough to give her nightmares. That seemed like something a dangerous person would do. Melanie's husband tried to calm her down, but she pushed her chair back from the table. She said we were done here, and there was nothing left to discuss. We all stood up and walked out of the restaurant without finishing our food. The parking lot was bright with afternoon sun, and I had to squint against it. Melanie and her husband went to their car without saying goodbye. My husband unlocked our car and we got in. He started driving, and neither of us said anything for the first 10 minutes. I stared out the window watching houses and stores go by. Everything looked normal out there. People walking dogs and kids riding bikes, like the world hadn't just confirmed that I'd destroyed a family relationship forever. My husband kept his eyes on the road. I thought about asking him if he thought I was dangerous too, but I was scared of what he might say. We pulled into our driveway and sat there for a minute before going inside. I wondered if getting revenge on Melanie had been worth losing her and Grace permanently, worth becoming someone my own family might be afraid of. The answer felt like no, but I couldn't take it back now. 2 weeks later, Ryan's therapist called and asked if I could come in for a meeting without Ryan. My stomach dropped when she said that because I figured she'd heard about the family drama and wanted to confront me about it. I spent the drive to her office rehearsing excuses in my head. When I got there, she smiled and asked me to sit down. She said she wanted to talk about Ryan's progress. He'd been doing really well lately, working through his fear responses better and using his coping strategies. Then she said something that made me freeze. She told me Ryan had mentioned at his last session that his cousin Grace got scared at her dance recital. Ryan said he felt bad for Grace because he knew what it was like to be really scared of something. The therapist said it showed Ryan was developing empathy and emotional awareness, which were good signs for his healing. I sat there trying to keep my face normal while shame burned through me. My 8-year-old son felt sorry for his cousin while I'd been busy planning revenge. The drive home felt longer than usual. I kept thinking about what the therapist said, how Ryan showed empathy for Grace's fear. He was being a better person at 8 than I'd managed to be as an adult. That thought made me feel small and awful. Ryan understood what Grace was going through because he'd lived through the same kind of terror. He didn't want her to hurt like he'd hurt. But I'd deliberately caused that hurt to prove a point to Melanie. I'd used a child's phobia as a weapon in an adult fight. My son was showing more emotional growth than I was, and that realization sat heavy in my chest. I pulled into the driveway and just sat in the car for a while before going inside. Ryan was watching TV in the living room, and he looked up and smiled at me when I came in. I smiled back, but it felt fake on my face. At the next therapy session, I asked to talk to the therapist for a few minutes after Ryan's appointment. She sent him out to the waiting room and asked what was on my mind. I couldn't quite make myself say what I'd done out loud. Couldn't admit that I'd deliberately traumatized Grace with that dummy. Instead, I asked her a different question. I said hypothetically, if a parent did something they regretted while trying to protect their child, did that make them a bad person? She looked at me for a long moment, and I wondered if she could see right through my hypothetical question to the truth underneath. She said parents sometimes make choices they later regret when they're in protective mode. She said the real question wasn't whether the choice was right or wrong, but what we do with that knowledge afterward. Do we learn from it and try to be better, or do we keep justifying it to ourselves? I nodded like I understood, but I wasn't sure I did. I thanked her and collected Ryan from the waiting room. On the drive home, I kept thinking about her question. What was I going to do with the knowledge that I'd hurt Grace on purpose? October turned into November, and my mother called one evening. She said she was hosting Thanksgiving this year, and both Melanie and I were expected to come. She said it was important for family unity that we all showed up and acted civil for one day. Her voice had that tone that meant she wasn't asking, she was telling. I agreed because you don't say no to my mother when she uses that voice, but my stomach twisted at the thought of it. The whole next week I felt sick thinking about Thanksgiving. Grace and Ryan would both be there. I'd have to see what I'd done to Grace, see the fear in her eyes, see how my revenge had damaged her just like the tarantula had damaged Ryan. I tried to focus on normal things like grocery shopping and helping Ryan with homework, but the dread sat in the back of my mind constantly. My husband asked if I wanted to skip Thanksgiving, but I said no. Avoiding it would just make things worse, and my mother would never forgive me. Thanksgiving Day came, and we got to my mother's house right on time. Cars already filled the driveway, and I recognized Melanie's among them. My hands felt sweaty on the steering wheel. We went inside, and the house smelled like turkey and stuffing. Family members were scattered through the living room and kitchen. I spotted Melanie right away standing near the fireplace with Grace pressed against her side. Grace looked smaller than I remembered. Thinner, with dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't been sleeping well. Those circles looked exactly like the ones Ryan had after his birthday party, the exhausted look of a kid who's been having nightmares. Grace's eyes met mine for just a second before she looked away fast and moved even closer to Melanie. Melanie wrapped her arm around Grace's shoulders, and they moved to a different part of the room, away from me. I felt my throat get tight watching them. Ryan found the dessert table within 5 minutes, like kids always do. He grabbed a cookie and then noticed Grace standing with Melanie across the room. He walked over to her and said something about the pumpkin pie, just normal kid conversation about dessert. Grace's whole body went stiff, and she took a step back from Ryan. She shook her head and turned away, pressing her face into Melanie's side. Ryan stood there looking confused and a little hurt. He came back to me and asked why Grace didn't want to talk to him. I told him she was probably just shy today, and he should give her some space. But I knew the real reason. Grace was scared of me, and by extension scared of my son, and that was my fault. I'd done that to both of them. Watching Ryan get rejected by his cousin because of what I'd done felt worse than anything Melanie had said to me at the restaurant. Dinner was awkward and tense. Melanie and I sat at opposite ends of the long table and didn't speak to each other at all. We both talked to other relatives and passed dishes when asked, but we might as well have been in different rooms. The tension made everyone else uncomfortable. People's conversations felt forced and too loud. My uncle tried to make a joke about family drama halfway through the meal. He said something about how families that fight together stay together, trying to lighten the mood. Nobody laughed. The silence after his joke stretched out painfully, and he looked down at his plate. My mother gave him a look that could freeze water. Grace barely ate anything, just pushed food around her plate. Ryan kept glancing at her like he wanted to try talking to her again but didn't dare. I cut my turkey into smaller and smaller pieces without actually eating much. The whole meal felt like something we all had to endure rather than enjoy, and I knew that was largely my fault for what I'd done to Grace. After dinner ended, people started moving around the house in that lazy way families do when nobody wants to leave yet. I walked through the hallway looking for the bathroom and past my mother's study. The door was half open, and I saw Grace sitting in the big leather chair by the window with a book in her lap. She wasn't really reading it, just staring at the pages like the words didn't make sense. Her legs were tucked up under her, and she looked so small in that chair, smaller than a 9-year-old should look. I stopped in the doorway and watched her for a second. She didn't notice me at first. The room was quiet except for the distant sound of people talking in the kitchen. I wanted to say something, wanted to tell her I was sorry for what I did at her recital. The words were right there in my throat, ready to come out. But saying sorry would mean admitting I knew exactly what I was doing when I bought that dummy. It would mean admitting I wanted to scare her on purpose, wanted to hurt her the same way Melanie hurt Ryan. And I wasn't ready to say that out loud, especially not to Grace herself. So I just stood there like a coward, watching this kid I traumatized sit alone in a dark study. Grace looked up and saw me in the doorway. Her whole body went stiff and her eyes got wide. She pulled the book closer to her chest like it could protect her from me. I cleared my throat and tried to smile, but it felt wrong on my face. I told her I hoped she had fun at her dance recital before everything got weird. The words came out flat and awkward. Grace stared at me with those huge, scared eyes that reminded me way too much of how Ryan looked after his birthday party. She said in this tiny voice that she doesn't like recitals anymore. Just like that. Simple and honest in the way kids are. She doesn't like recitals anymore because of what I did. Because I gave her that nightmare dummy and ruined something she used to love. I felt my throat get tight and my eyes started burning. I mumbled something about needing to find the bathroom and left before she could see me cry. I walked fast down the hallway and locked myself in the bathroom, standing there with my hands on the sink trying not to think about the look on her face. We drove home around 8 o'clock when Ryan started getting tired. He sat in the back seat looking out the window at the dark streets going by. My husband was driving and I was in the passenger seat, both of us quiet and tired from the long day. Ryan broke the silence by asking why Grace seems so sad now when she used to be fun. He said it in that confused way kids do when they notice something is wrong but don't understand why. I turned around to look at him in the back seat. He was still staring out the window, his reflection small in the dark glass. I told him that sometimes people go through hard times and they need space to feel better. It was the best answer I could come up with that wasn't a lie but also didn't tell him the real truth. Ryan nodded slowly like he was thinking about it. Then he said, "Maybe we should give her one of his stuffed animals to help her feel better. He has this collection of superhero stuffed animals that he loves, and he wanted to give one to Grace because he knows what it's like to be scared. My chest got tight again, and I had to look away. My 8-year-old son, who still has nightmares about spiders, wanted to help the cousin I deliberately hurt. He had more kindness in him than I did. That night, after Ryan went to bed, my husband and I sat in the living room with the TV off. The house was quiet and dark except for one lamp in the corner. He asked me if I thought what I did was justified. Really justified. Not just in the moment when I was angry, but now after seeing Grace at dinner. I sat there for a long time not saying anything. Part of me still felt like Melanie deserved it, like she needed to understand what she put Ryan through. But another part of me kept seeing Grace's face when she said she doesn't like recitals anymore. My husband waited for me to answer. He's good at that. Just waiting without pushing. I told him I understood the impulse to protect Ryan and make Melanie feel what we felt. He nodded and said he got that. He really did. But then he said he wished I'd talked to him first before doing it. I admitted that I knew he would have tried to stop me. I knew it was wrong even when I was doing it, which somehow made it worse. Knowing something is wrong and doing it anyway is different from making a mistake. The next day, I called my sister Cecilia. She lives about an hour away, and we talk on the phone every week or so. I needed to tell someone the truth. The whole truth without trying to make it sound better than it was. She answered on the third ring and asked how Thanksgiving went. I told her it was awful, and then I just said it. I told her I deliberately hurt Grace to get revenge on Melanie. I said the words out loud for the first time, and they sounded worse than they did in my head. I explained about buying the dummy and knowing about her fear and giving it to her at the recital. Saying it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. It wasn't just something that happened or a mistake I made. It was something I planned and executed on purpose. I started crying while I was talking, my voice getting all shaky and weird. I told Cecilia I didn't know how to fix what I'd done. How do you fix deliberately scaring a kid? How do you take back something like that? Cecilia was quiet for a minute after I finished. Then she said something that hit me hard. She said I can't fix it because the damage is done. Grace is going to remember that recital and that dummy for the rest of her life, just like Ryan will remember the tarantula. But I can choose not to make it worse by pretending it was justified or that Melanie drove me to it. She said I need to be honest with myself about what kind of person I became in that moment, even if I never say it to Melanie. Even if the family never knows the full truth. I need to know it and sit with it and decide what to do with that knowledge. Her words made me feel worse, but also a little bit better, if that makes sense. Worse because she was right that I couldn't undo it. Better because at least someone was being honest with me instead of just taking sides. The following week, Ryan had therapy, and it went really well. When I picked him up, his therapist asked to talk to me for a few minutes. She said Ryan had spent most of the session talking about feeling bad for other kids who get scared of things. He told her about a boy at the school who's afraid of dogs, and how Ryan stood between him and a dog at recess. He talked about understanding what it feels like to be scared and wanting to help people who feel that way. His therapist said this was really good development, that he was building emotional intelligence and empathy. She said these are signs of healing even though the phobia itself remains. Ryan still can't look at pictures of spiders and still checks his closet every night, but he's learning to use his experience to help others. I sat there listening to her talk about my son's kindness and empathy, and all I could think about was how I used a child's fear as a weapon. Ryan was becoming a better person despite his trauma, and I had become a worse person because of it. A few days later, I was scrolling through social media and saw a post from Melanie. She didn't post often, usually just pictures of Grace at dance competitions or family stuff. But this post was different. It said that Grace was starting therapy for anxiety and asked for supportive thoughts. She didn't mention me or the recital or anything specific, but I knew what she was really saying. I knew Grace needed therapy because of what I did to her. The post had a bunch of comments from relatives saying they'd keep Grace in their thoughts and asking if there was anything they could do to help. My aunt commented with a heart emoji. My mother commented saying she loved Grace. I sat there staring at my phone feeling sick. This was my fault. Grace needed therapy now because I decided revenge was more important than a child's mental health. My brother texted me that same afternoon. The message said Melanie was playing victim and I shouldn't feel guilty about what happened. He said she brought it on herself by traumatizing Ryan first, and now she was acting like she was the injured party. He used words like karma and consequences. His message should have made me feel better, or at least validated. But instead, it made me feel worse. I didn't want to be the kind of person who needed reassurance that hurting a kid was okay. I didn't want Frank's support because his support meant he thought what I did was fine. And it wasn't fine. It was revenge, and it was cruel, and no amount of Melanie being terrible first made it right. I realized Frank's support was actually making it easier for me to avoid real accountability. As long as people kept telling me Melanie deserved it, I could keep pretending I didn't do something horrible to a 9-year-old girl. 2 weeks before Christmas, my mother called me. She sounded tired on the phone, older than usual. She said she'd been thinking about the holidays and she couldn't handle having both Melanie and me at the same gathering. The tension was too much and it wasn't fair to everyone else in the family. So she decided to do separate celebrations this year. I could come Christmas Eve with Ryan and my husband. Melanie would get Christmas Day with Grace and her husband. She was splitting the family officially into 2 camps, 2 separate holidays, 2 separate celebrations. I told her I understood even though it made my chest hurt. She said she hoped it was temporary, that maybe next year things would be better. But we both knew that was probably not true. Some things don't heal. They just become permanent scars that everyone learns to work around. Christmas was going to be different now, split down the middle just like our family. Ryan came home from the school a few days later and found me in the kitchen putting away groceries. He dropped his backpack by the door and asked why we weren't doing big family Christmas this year like we always did. I stopped what I was doing and turned to face him, trying to figure out how to explain adult problems to an 8-year-old. I told him that sometimes grown-ups have disagreements that take time to work through, and this year we were doing something smaller and quieter. He stood there looking at me with those big worried eyes and asked if it was because of his birthday party. My heart sank watching him connect the dots. He said maybe if he hadn't been so scared of the spider, then everyone would still be together. And I could see him taking responsibility for something that wasn't his fault at all, blaming himself for the family breaking apart. I knelt down next to him and took his hands. I told him firmly that none of this was his fault, and his fear of spiders was real and valid. I said some people don't understand that fears can be serious, but that doesn't make the fear any less real. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't fully believe me. Even as I said the words, I knew the truth was more complicated. Ryan's birthday party was just the beginning. I was the one who escalated everything by going after Grace. I was the one who turned a family argument into something that split everyone apart. Ryan didn't cause this mess. I did when I decided revenge mattered more than being a good person. Christmas Eve arrived and we drove to my mother's house for our small gathering. Just us, my husband, my sister Cecilia, and my mom. No big crowd, no chaos, no Melanie. We ate dinner and opened a few presents. Ryan seemed happy enough playing with his new toys in the living room. After we cleaned up the dishes, my mother pulled me aside into the hallway. She looked tired and sad. She said she knew what I did to Grace. Her voice was quiet, not angry or loud. She just said she was disappointed that I let my anger turn me into someone who hurts children. No yelling, no big lecture, just those simple words about being disappointed. It cut deeper than any argument could have. Her quiet disappointment made me feel smaller than I'd felt in years. I tried to explain that Melanie showed no remorse for what she did to Ryan. My mother nodded and said that was true. But then she said it didn't justify what I did to Grace. She said 2 wrongs don't make a right, and even though I'm a grown woman with a child of my own, I felt like I was 10 years old being scolded for doing something mean on the playground. She didn't raise her voice once. She just looked at me with this sad expression that said she expected better from me. We went back to the living room and finished the evening, but her words stayed with me the whole night. New Year's Eve came and went without any big celebration. We stayed home and watched movies with Ryan until he fell asleep on the couch. My husband and I sat there in the quiet house after midnight, not really talking, just existing in the space together. I found myself thinking about what kind of person I wanted to be this year. I couldn't undo what I did to Grace. That damage was permanent. But I could stop lying to myself about it being completely justified. I could stop pretending that Melanie being terrible first made my actions okay. I spent the first week of January just sitting with that uncomfortable truth. Ryan woke me up one night in mid-January. He was crying and shaking, another nightmare about spiders. I brought him into our bed and held him until he calmed down. He asked me if Grace had nightmares too. I told him probably yes. He was quiet for a minute, then said we should tell her it gets a little better with time, that maybe knowing someone else understood would help her feel less alone. My 8-year-old son was showing more compassion and emotional intelligence than I had managed. He was thinking about Grace's feelings while I'd been focused on hurting her to prove a point. I told him that was a really kind thought, and maybe someday we could tell her that. I wrote an apology letter to Grace a few days later. I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and paper, trying to find the right words. I'm sorry I scared you. I'm sorry I used your fear against you. I'm sorry I hurt you to get back at your mom. But halfway through writing it, I realized the letter was more about making myself feel better than actually helping Grace. A real apology would mean facing Melanie and admitting out loud that I deliberately traumatized her daughter. It would mean taking full responsibility without any excuses about what Melanie did first. I wasn't ready for that conversation. I wasn't ready to say those words out loud and own them completely. So I folded up the letter and put it in my desk drawer where it would stay hidden. February brought Ryan's 9-month therapy check-in. His therapist said he'd made significant progress despite the major setback from his birthday. She said his coping strategies were improving, and he was learning to manage his fear better. She mentioned that having family support and validation of his fear had been crucial for his healing. Knowing that people believed him and didn't dismiss his phobia made him feel safe enough to work on it. I thought about Grace and wondered if Melanie was giving her that same support, or if she was still pretending everything was fine. I asked the therapist a hypothetical question about kids whose trauma gets dismissed by family members. She explained that invalidation often causes more lasting damage than the initial fear itself. When kids aren't believed or are told their fear is silly or made up, they learn they can't trust their own feelings. They learn that asking for help is pointless because nobody will listen. The fear becomes wrapped up in shame and isolation, making it harder to heal. I sat there thinking about how Melanie's dismissal of Ryan's phobia made everything so much worse. How her insistence that he just needed to toughen up added a layer of humiliation on top of genuine terror. But then I realized I did the same thing to Grace. I didn't dismiss her fear. I weaponized it. I took something that scared her and used it as a weapon to hurt her on purpose. That understanding settled heavy in my chest like a stone. Dismissing someone's fear is bad, but using their fear against them might actually be worse. At least dismissal comes from ignorance or misguided beliefs about toughness. What I did came from deliberate cruelty. I knew exactly how scared Grace would be, and I gave her that dummy anyway. I sat in my car outside the therapist's office for 20 minutes after the appointment, just staring at nothing and feeling the full weight of what I'd done. March brought warmer weather and longer days, and my aunt called one afternoon to chat about family stuff. She mentioned Grace was doing better in therapy and seemed less jumpy around everyday things. But then she said Grace refused to go back to dance class even though she used to love it more than anything. The studio kept calling to ask when she'd return because she was one of their best students, but Grace would start crying whenever her mom brought it up. My aunt said the recital had ruined something Grace loved, and hearing that made my stomach twist into a hard knot. I'd taken away something that brought Grace joy, something she was good at, something that made her feel confident. The dummy scared her for one night, but I'd destroyed her relationship with dancing. That felt heavier than anything else, knowing I'd reached into her life and pulled out something good and replaced it with fear. 2 weeks later, a distant relative died and the whole family had to attend the funeral. I knew Melanie would be there because this relative was connected to both sides of the family. I dressed Ryan in his nice clothes and told him we'd probably see Grace, but to just be polite and not make a big deal about anything. The funeral home was crowded with relatives I barely recognized, and I spotted Melanie across the room standing near the casket with Grace pressed against her side. Grace looked smaller than I remembered. Thinner, maybe, with her hair pulled back tight. Melanie had her arm around Grace's shoulders and kept glancing down at her daughter every few seconds like she was checking to make sure Grace was okay. I watched them during the service and saw how Melanie's hand never left Grace's back, how she leaned down to whisper reassurances when Grace shifted nervously, how she positioned herself between Grace and the crowd of relatives. It was the exact same way I stood with Ryan at family events. The same protective stance, the same constant checking. We were doing the same thing for our kids, and seeing that made something uncomfortable settle in my chest. After the service, everyone gathered in the church basement for coffee and cookies. Several relatives cornered me near the dessert table and started talking about how sad it was that Melanie and I weren't speaking anymore. My uncle said family was too important to let disagreements tear us apart. My mother's friend said both kids were fine now, so maybe we should just move past it for everyone's sake. Another cousin suggested we sit down and talk it through like adults. They kept using words like reconciliation and forgiveness and moving forward, but none of them had watched their kid throw up from fear or heard their kid's nightmares. I told them politely that some things couldn't be fixed with a conversation. Across the room, other relatives were probably having the same talk with Melanie. We made eye contact once across the crowded basement, and neither of us looked away or smiled or nodded. We just looked at each other for a few seconds before turning back to our separate conversations. That moment told me everything I needed to know about where we stood. My mother called the next week and said she'd been thinking about everything that happened. She suggested family counseling for all of us together, maybe with a professional who could help us work through the damage and find a way forward. She said Grace and Ryan deserved to have their family back, and maybe a therapist could help Melanie and me understand each other better. I told her I'd think about it, but 2 days later she called back sounding frustrated. Melanie had refused to participate if I was going to be there. She'd told my mother that she couldn't sit in a room with someone who deliberately hurt her daughter, and she wouldn't pretend everything was fine just to make the family comfortable. My mother asked if I would go to counseling without Melanie, maybe just with her and my husband and Ryan, but I said no. I told my mother I understood that some family rifts don't heal, they just become permanent boundaries that everyone has to learn to live with. She was quiet for a long time before agreeing that maybe I was right. Ryan finished 3rd grade in early June and brought home his report card with good grades and a note from his teacher. The note said Ryan was kind to other students and always helped kids who were struggling with their work. It mentioned his social skills had improved a lot over the year, and he was a positive presence in the classroom. His teacher wrote that Ryan showed empathy and patience, especially with kids who were scared or upset about things. Reading that made me proud because it meant he was growing into a good person, despite everything that happened. His spider phobia was still there, and probably always would be. He'd learned coping strategies in therapy like breathing exercises and positive self-talk, but he still couldn't look at pictures of spiders without getting anxious. The therapist said that was okay, that managing a fear was just as valid as overcoming it completely. Ryan seemed proud of his progress even though he still had to leave the room when nature documentaries showed spiders. He'd learned he could live with his fear instead of letting it control his whole life. My mother hosted a family barbecue in early July and everyone was invited. I almost didn't go because I knew Melanie would be there. But Ryan wanted to see his cousins, and I didn't want to keep him away from family events. We showed up around noon, and I immediately scanned the backyard looking for Melanie and Grace. I spotted Grace near the pool laughing with two younger cousins, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in months. She was smiling and gesturing while telling some story, and for a second she looked like the confident kid I remembered from before the recital. But then she glanced toward the patio and saw me watching her. Her smile disappeared completely. She stopped talking mid-sentence and moved away from where I was standing, putting more distance between us. The younger cousins followed her, confused about why she suddenly wanted to go inside. I understood in that moment that I would always be the person who scared her on purpose. It didn't matter how much time passed or how much Grace healed. When she looked at me, she would remember the dummy and the recital and the feeling of being terrified in front of everyone. I'd permanently changed how she saw me, and there was no going back from that. Melanie and I didn't speak at the barbecue, but we'd developed this unspoken system over the past few months. She arrived first and claimed the patio area near the grill. I stayed by the pool with Ryan and my husband. When she moved toward the dessert table, I went inside to help my mother with drinks. We timed our movements to avoid being in the same space, like some kind of sad dance where both people knew the steps. Other relatives noticed and tried to casually bring us together by asking us both to help with something or suggesting we grab food at the same time, but we always found excuses. It was exhausting keeping track of where Melanie was and planning my movements around hers. It made family events feel like work instead of fun, but it was the only way we could both show up without constant conflict, so we kept doing it. That night after we got home, my husband sat down next to me on the couch and took my hand. He said he was proud of how I'd handled everything over the past few months. I started to interrupt, but he kept going, saying he knew the original action was wrong, but watching me sit with the discomfort of what I did instead of justifying it showed real growth. He said a lot of people would have kept insisting they were right, or making excuses about what Melanie did first. But I'd been honest with myself and him about feeling guilty, about recognizing I'd hurt Grace on purpose, about understanding the weight of that choice. His support meant everything, even though I still felt guilty most days. Some nights I still lay awake thinking about Grace's scream, and wondering if I'd become the kind of person I never wanted to be. A few weeks later, Ryan came into my bedroom at night when he was supposed to be sleeping. He climbed onto the bed and asked if I was sad that we don't see Grace anymore. The question caught me off guard because I didn't realize he'd noticed how much our family dynamics had changed. I told him honestly that yes, I was sad about it. He was quiet for a minute, then said maybe when they're older they could be friends again. He said kids at the school sometimes fight and stop being friends, but then later they make up and it's okay. His hope for future healing reminded me that kids are more resilient than adults. They don't hold on to anger and hurt the same way we do. Maybe Ryan and Grace would find a way back to each other someday, even if Melanie and I never did. I hugged him and told him that was a nice thought, and he went back to bed seeming satisfied with that answer. I ran into Melanie's husband at the grocery store in August. We both froze when we saw each other in the cereal aisle, then had this awkward moment of deciding whether to acknowledge each other or pretend we hadn't noticed. He nodded, and I nodded back, and somehow that turned into a brief conversation about back-to-school shopping and summer ending. He mentioned Grace still had nightmares sometimes, said it casually like he was just making conversation, but I knew he was telling me on purpose. I told him Ryan had nightmares too, still checked his closet every night before bed. We stood there for a moment with our shopping carts, two parents whose kids both suffered, and there was this shared understanding passing between us. Neither of us caused our kids' original fears, but the adults in their lives had made everything so much worse. He said he hoped both kids would be okay eventually, and I agreed. Then we went our separate ways down different aisles, and I stood there staring at cereal boxes, feeling the full weight of everything that happened over the past year. Summer ended with Ryan starting 4th grade and Grace beginning 5th. A full year had passed since the tarantula disaster at the birthday party. I found myself marking time that way now, measuring events as before or after that moment when everything broke. Both kids were still in therapy every week. Ryan's therapist said he was making progress with his coping strategies, but the phobia itself hadn't gone away. He still checked his closet and under his bed every single night before sleeping. Grace was apparently doing similar work with her own therapist, working through the dummy incident and the underlying doll fear from that horror movie years ago. My aunt mentioned it once during a phone call, her voice careful like she was testing whether I'd react. The family remained split into clear camps. Some relatives thought what I did was justified after Melanie traumatized Ryan first. Others said two wrongs don't make a right and I should have been the bigger person. Most family gatherings now had this weird tension where people chose sides without saying it out loud. Melanie and I hadn't spoken directly since that awful restaurant meeting back in spring. We communicated through other family members when absolutely necessary, like figuring out who would attend which holiday events. My mother decided to host a birthday party for my uncle in late August, right before school started. She made it clear that both families were expected to attend, because this was about celebrating my uncle, not about our drama. I almost said no, but Ryan wanted to go because he liked my uncle and missed seeing that side of the family. We showed up early to help set up tables in the backyard. Melanie arrived an hour later with Grace and her husband. We made eye contact across the yard and both nodded, this stiff, awkward acknowledgement that we existed in the same space. Several relatives noticed and made comments about how nice it was that we were being civil. My aunt said it was real progress and maybe time would heal things. But it felt hollow and forced, like we were both performing politeness for everyone else's comfort. I stayed on one side of the yard near the grill where my husband was helping cook. Melanie stayed on the other side near the dessert table, keeping Grace close. We moved around each other like magnets with the same charge, maintaining careful distance. The party went on for a few hours with people eating and talking, and my uncle opening presents. Ryan played with some younger cousins on the swing set, seeming relaxed and happy. Grace sat with some older kids at a picnic table, quieter than I remembered her being before all this happened. Then I saw Ryan walk toward the dessert table to get another cookie. Grace was standing there looking at the cake options. They ended up next to each other, both reaching for plates. Ryan said something about 4th grade starting next week. Grace said she was nervous about 5th grade and the harder homework. Their voices were quiet and stilted, like they were reading lines they'd practiced. Ryan asked if she still did dance class. Grace shook her head and said not anymore, changing the subject to ask about his superhero collection. They talked for maybe 2 minutes total, both of them looking uncomfortable but trying. Other kids came over and they scattered to different parts of the yard. But I'd seen it happen. This tiny moment of two kids attempting to be normal with each other despite everything the adults had done. I stood there watching Ryan and Grace from opposite sides of the yard, both of them laughing with other cousins now like that brief conversation had taken all their courage. The guilt hit me fresh and sharp. Protecting your child sometimes means becoming someone you don't fully recognize, someone capable of deliberate cruelty to prove a point. I didn't regret defending Ryan's boundaries or making Melanie understand his pain through the only method that seemed to work. She never would have truly understood what she'd done to him without experiencing that same helpless rage watching her own child suffer. But I'd always carry the knowledge that I deliberately hurt a 9-year-old girl to teach her mother a lesson. Grace's scream in that auditorium would live in my memory right next to Ryan's scream at his birthday party, 2 sounds of childhood terror that I couldn't undo. The family had learned to function around the damage we'd all caused, finding ways to exist in the same spaces without direct conflict. Maybe that was the best any of us could hope for now. Ryan and Grace might heal faster than the adults would. Their brief conversation at the dessert table proof that kids don't hold on to anger the same way we do. But the cost of this whole mess would follow all of us for years, shaping how we showed up at family events and who we trusted and what we were willing to do when someone hurt the people we loved most.